So this chapter is about writing skills for software architects. This is one of the things that you discover as you transition from a developer to architect, is now you're going to be responsible for a lot more prose writing because you have to make cases for things, and the prose that you write is going to get a lot more scrutiny than it did when you were just a developer. And so it's worth spending a little bit of time building some writing skills. Now, I'm not trying to turn you into a great novelist or anything like that, but clarity and communication skills goes a long way, because if you can come up with a really nice description for something, you cut down on the number of times you have to go back and explain it over and over again. So this is a poorly understood but very important skill for architects. And really, this is a reflection of the fact that software is more about communication than technology. If you look at the biggest problems in software development, just like DeMarco and Lister talk about in Peopleware, it's a people problem, and most of that people problem comes down to communication and not having good communication channels for software. So being able to communicate clearly will cut through a lot of headaches that you will generate otherwise. And this is also true from an analysis standpoint as well. This is a graph from the book Agile Software Development from Alistair Coburn from 2002. And he did an analysis that shows that the richness of the communication channel is directly related to how in context and how close you are with people. So for example, two people at a whiteboard is the best, richest kind of detailed design and architecture discussion you can have, because you can see body language, you can hear the tone of voice, you can draw pictures, you can do Q&A. That's about as good as it gets in terms of richness of communication channel. And it starts falling off very quickly beyond that. And in fact, one of the coldest versions is something written on paper on email, because you're missing a lot of the context that you get when you do this in person. So that's an even better reason to hone your skills of writing to make that communication channel as good as it can be. So one of the things that you will discover as you start communicating outside your normal circle of developers and technical people is that different people have different experience levels when you start talking about technical things. And this was nicely captured in the Dreyfus scale of external knowledge acquisition. This was used heavily in the nursing field and several other fields like that. They discovered the really best pilots. To take them as an example, they took the very best pilots and tried to get them to teach brand new novices, and found that that did not work well at all. It had to do with this Dreyfus scale. So the Dreyfus scale delineates 5 different stages you go through as you're trying to learn some new technical thing from an external source. And this can be any technical thing. This doesn't have to be technology like software. This could be learning a new problem domain from your business analyst. So this works both ways on projects, and so it's important to understand this. So on the Dreyfus scale, a novice is someone who basically doesn't understand how the underlying mechanisms work. They're just following recipes. So they have a series of steps. They can walk through those steps and get things done. If something breaks, they have no recourse of how to fix that, because they don't understand how the underlying stuff works. The next level up is called advanced beginner. This is someone who has followed recipes for a while, and now they kind of are starting to understand how the moving parts work a little bit. You can start doing very limited improvisation here. So for example, if one of your recipes breaks part of the way through, because you've had experience with lots of recipes, you can go, well, there was another recipe that had a slightly different step, so let me try that, and oh, that gets me past this hurdle, so I can keep moving forward. Competence, where you start really understanding how the moving parts work, and you can now get things done in a much more efficient way and understand mostly what's going on. Maybe you can't build frameworks yet, to put this in a technical standpoint, but you can consume and understand how the frameworks work. Someone who is proficient understands how all the moving parts work, and underneath the moving parts, at least one level of abstraction down from the level of abstraction that you're normally working at. So these are actually some of the best teachers for advanced beginners and novices, because they have a really deep knowledge about whatever the subject is, but they haven't passed into this kind of intuitive knowledge phase that experts have. which is the top of the list here. Experts have been doing this so long that they can't even explain how they do this anymore. And this is the problem they had with pilots. They would take pilots and put them in a flight simulator and then cause some sort of disturbance. And then they would ask them, okay, can you give us an analysis of how you handle that problem? And they said, I don't know. I just handle that problem the way that I handle that problem. They're so expert that they can't really elucidate anymore the steps that led them to that expertise. And I wanted to come up with some sort of analogy that would relate to most people watching this video, and I think I've hit upon it. Presumably you can type, that you're a pretty good touch typist. And assume for a moment that I've never typed before, and I've noticed that when you type compound letters like OU and GH and TH, those are really common letter combinations in the English language, that you don't type those at the same speed as you type the kind of arbitrary letters, that you kind of bunch and cluster those common pairings together. I'm not a typist at all, and I want to become an expert typist, so explain exactly how you do that bunching when you type. That's a level of expertise because you've forgotten what mechanism led you to that because it's just a natural thing that you do now. And I used a Lego construction as my exemplar here, starting with the simple little house and ending with an actual working harpsichord built in Legos, which I think shows quite a bit of expertise in the Lego world. The other thing about the Dreyfus scale is that most people, for their day job, are only at the advanced beginner level, which means they know recipes and a little bit of the underlying mechanisms, but not much beyond that. What this means as an architect on a project, you now have to start writing things that business analysts and QA people and C-level executives understand. They are going to be on the novice or advanced beginner scale at best in terms of technology. So you really need to understand your audience so that you can pitch your writing at exactly the right level so that it's not over their head or it's not too simplistic. And in fact, that's my first and maybe most critical piece of advice is know your audience and who you're writing for. If you're writing for business executives, don't put a lot of technical details in it. And this is really hard for architects because that's the exciting part for you, are all the technical details. And in fact, probably the most exciting part for you is the really, really hard problem that you solved in a really elegant way. That's really not that interesting to the business people as long as it's a solved problem. Just because you had this really elegant solution that other technologists might appreciate, they really want to know the aggregate of how it works and how it's going to impact their ability to do their job. So knowing who your audience is before you start writing something is the key to actually writing at the right level and getting the right level of detail and the right level of understanding for your target audience. Steve Martin has a great quote about this, the famous comedian and a Renaissance man, and he says, some people have a way with words and other people not have way. This is a problem, of course, when writing. Getting the right combinations of words together is really, really tricky. Now, I'm not a big fan of style guides. There's the famous Strunk and White style guide. There are a variety of style guides out in the world. Mostly for me, when I read them, I cannot help but picture my third grade teacher with a ruler in her hand, yelling at me about all the things that I've written and trying to get me to convert them to what to me sounds like much more stilted versions of that. But this book is particularly good. This is Steven Pinker, who is a well-known writer in both the grammar world and also just general cognitive kind of research. And he has written a book, a relatively short style guide called The Sense of Style. And he does a really, really good job of kind of debunking most style guides and really pushing back toward the kind of pragmatic prose that matches the kind of pragmatism we kind of like in architecture. And he talks about two styles of writing in this book that I think is an important distinction. One is practical writing, which is the kind of writing that you will typically do if you're writing about a framework or some sort of descriptive writing about something technical. The other thing that he makes a distinction here is what he calls classic style, which is a very clean prose, and the real emphasis here is knowing your audience and knowing what what your audience already knows. One of the problems that a lot of beginning technical writers have is they shoot too low for their audience and end up putting way too many irrelevant details in their prose. Classic style says, assume that your audience knows what you do, or if you know exactly who your audience is, then write exactly to that audience and try to keep the amount of embellishment down as much as possible. Particularly for technical writing, you're not trying to write a Faulkner novel here. You're trying to write something that is as clear as possible. And one of the things you have to avoid when you're doing writing, technical writing, is passive voice. This is a bad habit that a lot of people have because it's something that when you speak, it doesn't stick out as badly as when you write. Passive voice occurs when you make the object of an action into the subject of a sentence. So this is a passive voice version of the very famous, why did the chicken cross the road? Why was the road crossed by the chicken? Let me talk about a few myths about passive voice. One is that the use of passive voice constitutes a grammatical error, and that's not true at all. In fact, I'll show you in just a bit some strategic places where you will want to use passive voice. This is a myth because your grammar checker flags passive voice, and so people think this is a grammatical error. This is really just an accusation of not being as clear as you could be when you write prose. That's what your grammar checker is yelling at you about, but it's not technically a grammatical error when you do this. Another myth is that any use of the word to be constitutes passive voice, and that's not true. Very common constructs end up using the passive voice, but you can write perfectly legal non-passive sentences and still use is, particularly when you're describing something. Another myth is that the passive voice always avoids the first person, which is also not true. Often the first person hides in passive voice, which I'll talk about in a second, but that's not always the case. Another myth is that you should never use passive voice, and as I say, you can use it strategically. In fact, you may find yourself needing to use it strategically at some point. And number 5 is I can rely on my grammar checker to catch it. Your grammar checker is only doing an algorithm to try to find occurrences of passive voice, and it doesn't flag them all correctly, so you can't really rely on this to chase these things away from you. So let me give you some examples and some better versions of sentences that don't have passive voice. So here's an example of passive voice. The metropolis has been scorched by the dragon's fiery breath. What are we hiding there? What are we switching around? So the better version of this is the dragon scorched the metropolis with his fiery breath. So we've switched the object of action into the subject of the sentence. Here's a famous one from the Odyssey. When her house was invaded, Penelope had to think of ways to delay her marriage. Who's hiding here? We're hiding something here. We're hiding the people who invaded her house. And so the better version of this sentence is when after suitors invaded her house, Penelope had to think of ways to delay her marriage. So this is why people don't like passive voice, is because you're hiding something when you put a passive voice sentence in place. Heart disease is considered the leading cause of death in the United States. What are we hiding here? Who considers it the leading cause of death? Research points to heart disease as the leading cause of death in the United States. And in fact, you could probably make this sentence even better by saying that researchers have concluded that heart disease is the leading cause of death in the United States. Another example is the balloon is positioned in an area of the blockage and is inflated. What's hiding here? The person doing the action, the surgeon, positions the balloon into an area of blockage and inflates it. This is the reason that people don't like passive voice in prose, is because you're hiding something. And when you read that sentence, you have to kind of mentally reconstruct the missing piece. It makes reading more difficult because you're having to do more cognitive work to kind of figure out what the hiding piece is in that sentence. This is why passive voice is frowned on, not a grammatical error, but a failure in clarity of prose. Now, there are places where you want to use passive voice. This is what George Orwell famously calls swindles and perversions using language. And here's a classic example of the useful use of passive voice. Mistakes were made. I'm not saying who made the mistakes. I'm purposely hiding who made the mistakes. I'm just saying that mistakes were made. Another good example of that is the Exxon company accepts that a few gallons might have been spilled. So the point of this is the use of language shapes clarity and meaning in that language. And some people use passive voice to avoid mentioning responsibility for certain actions. This is the strategic use of passive voice so that you don't have to call yourself out for doing something that may not be so good. And it's really, really common. This is the kind of thing that drives me crazy and consequently drives my wife crazy. If you look at the iPhone network setting dialog at the very bottom, that's passive voice. Known networks will be joined automatically. So a much better version of that phrase is your phone will join known networks automatically. But I'll talk in a second about having too many words, what I call hiccup words, because when you speak, you end up inserting words that you don't need when you write. And this is a good example that will doesn't really need to be there. Your phone automatically joins known networks is a better version of that sentence because the will is extraneous. You don't need will there. The join handles that automatically. I also, as a writer, can't resist revising the second sentence here as well to make it read, at least to my mind, is a little better. If no known networks are available, you must manually select a network. So the most important rule I can give you in terms of writing, I'm not going to give you a bunch of rules about subject-verb disagreement and comma splices and all those things. A Sense of Style covers those in probably the least painful way of any book that I've ever read. The thing that I want to impart on you is the most important rule by far when you do writing is to revise. Revising is the thing that makes professional writers and not amateur writers. And you need to get used to this idea of revising everything. Get into the habit of revising things that you write, particularly important documentation. If you're trying to make a case for something like an architectural refactoring, a new technical direction for the company, maybe you're trying to support the case for a new framework or a new programming language or something like that, you're the architect on the project. It is your job to make that pitch, and you want to make that pitch as convincingly as possible, both to the people, your underlings that you're trying to convince, but also people who are going to do funding and other sorts of things like that. So create a version of that document, do several drafts of it, and revise it and make it better over time. The same is true for any kind of proposals you create. You should also start doing this for emails. This is a really tricky thing because as a developer, the only people who are really scrutinizing your emails are the people that are directly in your team. They're probably as part of your project and they know you pretty well. But as an architect, your email graph is going to expand significantly into a lot of different roles. I don't suggest that you spend multiple drafts on every email, but many people never even read over it once when they type an email in and just send it. Get into the habit of at least reading back over it to make sure it makes sense, and maybe do a little revision along the way to make it to help clarity. Basically, all written correspondence, you need to get into a habit of doing regular revision, doing drafting and revision, and particularly very important things, don't put off the creating of the prose until the last minute. Actually start that process early and revise your way toward the finished version of it. So for technical writing, you really want to emphasize simple declarative sentences, draft and rewrite. And rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. This is the key to becoming a good writer, is to practice. You also want to spell check and grammar check all of your stuff. Grammar checking is actually less important because it's not as accurate as spell checking, but spell checking, of course, makes sure stuff look bad if you have misspelled words in it. And it's also a good idea to have someone else read it for clarity. There's a terrific book by Stephen King called On Writing, which is his experience about writing. And one of the things he talks about is having a trusted reader as the first one to read all of your stuff. Pick someone on your project as the trusted reader to read your proposals and your documentation and those sorts of things, and have them give you notes to enhance the clarity. You might also try to find a guinea pig that is in the role that you're targeting for this writing. So if you're writing a proposal to a business group, find someone in that business group and get them to read your drafts. That will show you the places where you've missed the audience, where they need more clarification or less detail. Getting someone in front of someone's eyes who's in a similar role is a really great way to get feedback to make sure that you've got that audience set correctly. This is what I was referring to before. A really tricky thing is to try to avoid non-words. When you speak, your brain and your mouth move at different rates, and so you naturally insert sounds and non-words into your vocal stream so that you can sync things back up. This is the common usage of and ah when people speak, those little break words like that. But you also hear people that pick up little phrases like, you know what I mean, or the thing that drives parents everywhere crazy, or teenagers, and the various incarnations of like and other non-words that they insert into their vocabulary as they're thinking about things. And your first sense when you start writing things is to write like you speak. But it turns out that you speak a lot more words than you should write. Lots of words like will are very often can be easily removed and actually improve the clarity of the sentence. And so anytime you write something down, look at it and read it and look for words that you can remove. Most revision is removing words, not adding new words, because you realize there are too many words there. So the advice here is to try to avoid non-words as much as possible. Another piece of advice here is to try to organize before you write. One of the points that Steven Pinker makes in Sense of Style is that your first draft is almost never very good because you've been thinking about it in your mind and you have a particular organization, and that organization implicitly ends up in the way you write things. And if someone else doesn't have those same structures in their brain, when they read that, they're not going to get the same resonance with that phrasing that you have in your brain. So it's important to organize your thoughts before you write them down, and of course revise once you've gotten them written down, because don't assume that the first way you write something down is necessarily going to be the clearest way. You've got to think about what about the people who are reading this that haven't been thinking about it and structuring in their brain for a while. So I'm a big fan of tools like outliners to do outlines before the fact. This is a really good commercial outliner called Omni Outliner that has a lot of really nice features in it. However, there is the best outliner on earth is the one that I use, which is the one, of course, in Emacs. There's an org mode in Emacs that gives you outliner capabilities, and what org mode does, of course, is leverage the industrial strength text handling capabilities that Emacs already has, and then overlays outline kind of behavior on top of it. So the text manipulation characteristics that are there in Emacs get you a lot of the way there, and then the extra really nicely implemented outliner features on top of that in org mode. The barrier of entry may be a little high on this for some people if you don't already know Emacs, but this may be a good excuse to go learn it. I'm also a big fan of mind maps as a way of capturing unstructured data. For example, when I work on brand new projects, I will very often have ideas about it, and I'll just kind of dump them in a mind map without trying to build any structure around it. Then when it comes time to really start revising and putting that down into some sort of cohesive form, that's when I go in, start creating structures, and start looking for those links between things that are not strictly in the hierarchy, but are often the most interesting things in a mind map. So there are several mind maps that you can use, both commercial and freeware mind maps, and I'm a big fan of those as a way to organize your thoughts. And so to summarize, organize before you write, get that out of your head, and get it into an organization before you start writing complete sentences for it. Try to emphasize the classic style. Don't over-embellish with lots of extra words. Try to be as clean and plain as possible, because most of the writing you're going to do in the role of architect is describing things that exist in the world, and so trying to make that as clear and simple as possible is your best goal there. And of course, the best advice is to revise on a regular basis. I once had a photographer tell me that the difference between a professional photographer and an amateur photographer is a professional photographer throws their mistakes away. The difference between a professional writer and an amateur writer is that a professional writer has embraced the fact that they need to revise and revise and revise, but every time you do that, you incrementally make that writing a little bit better, and so this is the best way to kind of converge toward a good version of your ideas.